When I try again, the gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I too can't believe we're sitting here with all the problems this country faces brought on by this administration, with the issues with border crossings, and it's been brought up about the deaths of mentally ill, those who kill children that are mentally ill. Look at those who have killed crossing because they have an open border. Look at the rapes that are occurring. And here we are talking about, is a biological man, should he be allowed to compete with biological women? Mr. Takano, help me understand now, is your definition of a transgender that person who gets a sex change operation, or is it just about that person who identifies?
No, sir. Not all. I don't know the relative numbers of transgender individuals who get a gender confirmation surgery. No, that's not necessarily a definition of someone who's transgender who physically alters, their biological characteristics. I think maybe the simplest way to maybe describe what a transgender person is somebody who is born with biological characteristics of one gender, but experience themselves as being of another gender. And I don't believe that these folks see this as a matter of choice. It's something, I think, akin to what a gay person feels, or a lesbian, when they see that they have attractions to the same sex, right? So it's an interior, subjective experience that is not something that is completely chosen.
But as it relates to this, if you identify as a female, not having the sex change operations, but if you identify as a female, you ought to be able to, biological man ought to be able to play in a biological female's sport.
Well, the short answer is yes, somebody who is trans.
Okay. That's all.
Someone who is trans, but understand, Mr. Norman, the idea that people would do this in order to take advantage of biological advantages, I think is just not correct. It's not true. And if you were to see some trans girls participate in sports, I think for the most part you would see that they're girls, pretty much girls.
Should Mike Tyson, have you heard of him?
Yes, I have.
If he identifies as a female, should he be allowed to box?
Well, look, again...
No, that's a very simple question, because you said yes, that if he identifies, should he be allowed to enter a boxing match with a biological female?
Well, I think there's room for, as the NAACA and the IOC, they've accepted trans women as athletes for many years on a sport-by-sport, case-by-case basis. It's not an absolute. It's not an absolute inclusion.
But the answer is yes. If he identifies, he ought to be able to box.
I didn't say that.
Earlier you said if he had. Well, let me just ask you this. I thought earlier you said if you identify, that yes, that qualifies
What it had to do with the question I think you're referring to is over facilities and bathrooms, about if they identify, if they want to participate. So if you want a trans girl, a trans woman, if that's what you identify as, I believe you should have the opportunity to participate in the sport that's consistent with your gender. You should be able. A trans girl needs to be able to participate.
She identifies as a. I'm asking. If she identifies as a female.
Yes.
If she identifies as a male, she ought to be able to compete.
Yeah. Well, look. The example you brought up of Mike Tyson that brings up this image of this extraordinary athlete, highly developed musculature. But the idea that males, trans women, That's who trans women are, or trans girls for that matter are these human beings that are going to take advantage of their biological advantages. I think that's a misconception about participation.
Have you looked at pictures of Leah Thomas?
I have.
As compared, is he obviously a male or is he a female?
I have. Well, I want to just remind you that this bill is not about most elite competitions. It's about K-12 and college students. And what this bill does, it's a blanket ban over all participation of trans girls and women. Okay, so this issue of elite, we're arguing about, we're discussing elite competitions, and that, I'm telling you, is something that can be, is already being dealt with and doesn't need the government, does not, I mean, I respect you, Ms. Norman. You have a defined philosophy about limitation of government. And I'm telling you that what this bill does, it doesn't, one, solve the problem of elite competition and the potential unfairness that may ensue. But what it does do is it eliminates the opportunity for trans kids to connect and be part of a community.
But Mark, I think Ms. Foxx, I'll get right with you. I think what you're saying is, though, if take Mike Tyson, take any athlete, if he's male, biological male, that he can identify and then cross compete, which that's staggering that you're saying something like that. Because roll the clock back.
Well, Mr. Roman, if I could just
quick question.
Okay, go ahead.
Would the gentleman yield for? Are we talking about Mike Tyson, whether or not he identifies as a female, continuing to compete as a heavyweight? Because this is one of, there's a classification there, so he would be competing as a heavyweight boxer.
I'm saying if there's a women's boxing team that he qualifies for the weight, he can identify, as I think what Mark says, he can identify as a female and compete. But what is staggering is roll the clock back to a Mike Tyson when he was 12 years old. The stature hadn't changed. He was a biological man. But I think what Mr. Takano is saying is he can identify even when he was 12 and enter a female's bathroom, and which is staggering to me. I don't know if you've talked to Riley Gaines as I have. When you had Leah Thomas assaulting females, you could see his male genitalia. You could see that, and he was assaulting young women. She's on the record with that. Assault
is not something that I would permit. Assault is something that I would hope a prosecutor would prosecute. And if there's evidence that there was an assault, there should be a prosecution for that assault. That should not be permitted.
Does that facilitate assault? Letting a biological man go into a biological female's bathroom?
What I would say is a trans person, someone who is trans, who identifies, they should be able to use the facilities that they identify with. But I want to go back and address this notion of Mike Tyson. Here again, we're talking about elite competition, and that's its own discussion, which this bill doesn't solve or address. What it does do is it eliminates the ability of teens to be able to participate in sports. I just remind you, Mr. Norman, in many states, wrestling competition is not separated. They don't have in many states a girls' wrestling team or a boys' wrestling team. The girls just compete with the guys according to weight class.
It's like Mr. Massey said, I think you're in favor of just doing away with male, female, let everybody compete, have a free-for-all.
Well, that's not true. It's not true. I'm in favor of increasing the opportunities for women and girls generally, that there's 1 million more opportunities for men and boys than there are for women and girls. And that's the problem that we need to be focused on, not the minute number of trans kids that want to participate in sports, and we shouldn't be stigmatizing or isolating them out. And I know it's that you're a religious man and that you would believe that we would not want to ostracize or subject people to bullying or even higher rates of suicidality. That's just wrong.
Correct. I agree with you. Ms. Foxx.
Thank you.
Well, I would just say that I've not heard the number that there are 1 million more opportunities for men than women or girls in sports. I don't understand why, for the past 4 years with the Democrats in the majority, they didn't do something about this. If this was such a big concern, or is such a big concern, they had an opportunity to do something about this. And not once have I heard this mentioned in the last 4 years. Not once. The other thing I'd mention, and I agree with Mr. Roy when he brought up his lack of respect for the associations. As far as I know, the NCAA and the IOC did nothing to help women advance in sports before Title IX. Not one thing did they ever do to lift a finger to help women and girls advance in sports. When Title IX was passed, then I think they got on board. But I think that bringing these things up about 1 million more opportunities for men, wow, if that exists, this is the first I've heard about it as a member of the committee. I'm surprised that there wasn't a hearing on this while the Democrats were in the majority, and they didn't say, well, we have to do more for Title IX. Suddenly, why aren't we doing more for women? It's just exactly, it seems to me, the opposite, is if biological males are allowed to compete with biological females, what's going to eventually happen, as somebody else mentioned, we're going backwards. We're going to erase women in sports because biological males will take advantage of this opportunity, I believe.
I'm glad you mentioned that. It happened with Riley Gaines.
Exactly, it did.
She won the race. It happened. And I don't know, evidently he identified as a female, and he won the race. You look at him, he's a biological male. End of story.
Well, I find it kind of interesting that for 3 years he was a mediocre member of the team.
You know what he ranked when he competed against biological men? 464th. How do you do that? Then you go to number one when you compete with biological female.
If it isn't being seen as an opportunity, then I don't know what it was in that particular situation.
Yeah, if that's not an opportunity that he took advantage of because of this insanity that's going on in this country with, trying to say that there's more than two sexes, there's a biological man and a biological woman. God made us that way. And let me ask you this, Ms. Foxx. Over the centuries with the archaeological remains, did they ever mention that anything other than male and female? Did they mention back then this remain was a transgender? Or?
Not.
You weren't around then, I know that.
No, thank you for that. No, I think we've always known that there have been situations where there have been people who've identified differently than the majority of the people, very small numbers of people. But I don't know of anything that has been done that would unearth more than the two sexes.
Two sexes. And if
I believe that the article that if you're interested in learning more about this, I think, and I think Mr. Massey talked about the genetics, the gametes, right? Gametes don't change. Yeah, you're either XX or XY.
Representative Norman, would you yield?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
So there was actually a fascinating article that I read of a rabbi who went through the Old Testament and identified the many different ways in which people were referred to, which included binary and many other things. I will find it and send it to you if you'd like.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah.
That was a legitimate question. I don't want to belabor it. We've exhausted this topic. But thank both of you for participating. And I will tell you, Mark, that there's opportunity for women now that have never existed. Women, biological women. Look at and Ashley mentioned MMA. MMA women are attracting a lot of followers.
Attention, yeah.
But now you put the Mike Tyson types into MMA, which he could easily go to. How fair would that be if you had a family member who did just what you said you agreed with, identify, and go thrown in with that? I think that's unfair.
Well,
it's not safe and it's not unfair.
Mr. Norman, if I could just respond
Sure.
to that scenario. I think the MMA folks would have a lot to say about that, just as the NCAA and the IOC have something to say about that. Their stance is not an absolute inclusion, right? They have a concern about fairness of competition. And so that's a legitimate discussion. It's a legitimate debate to have. But what I'm telling you is that this bill is not about addressing that unfairness that you're pointing to. What this bill does is it basically eliminates the ability of trans girls and women to participate in K through 12 and collegiate sports participation on the team with which they identify gender-wise. And I'm convinced if you and I explored this a lot longer, we would come to an understanding about this. And look, I think there's what you cite is at the elite competition level, the professional level. Let's allow those associations to figure that out.
Ms. Foxx?
I just want to say again what the bill says. It shall be a violation of subsection A for a recipient of federal financial assistance who operates, sponsors, or facilitates athletic programs or activities to permit a person whose sex is male to participate in an athletic program or activity that is designated for women or girls. For the purpose of this subsection, sex shall be recognized based solely on a person's reproductive biology and genetics at birth. One cannot change one's biological sex. It is not possible. So I don't care what term you use, you have to participate with the people whose biology matches your biology.
Which the most outspoken person today is Riley Gaines. When she went into that dressing room and witnessed Leah Thomas, or whatever his name was when he was a male, supposedly, he had genitalia, and he was definitely a male. And he competed when he couldn't compete with males, biological males. And to go from 464th to 1 is unfair. It's unfair to Riley Gaines and others. It sets a tone that I think it does get to the bathroom issue. It does get to safety. It does get to protection, which children deserve that. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman from South Carolina.